Tack så mycket. Yes, unfortunately I will have to speak English, even though I speak some Swedish, but not as well as English so far. I'm a researcher at Malmö University, as it has just been mentioned. My area of research is migration, so I'm very happy to have the opportunity today to present about the new asylum law in Sweden. But in order to do that, I would like to present it in a context, because Sweden, as any other country in the world, is not just separated from the international relations field, but it's a part within a system of relationships between different nation states and also regional agreements, such as within the European Union. So I will talk a little bit first about my current research project, just very briefly presenting it. It is called, I'm responsible for a project, for the Swedish part of the project called Informed. It's an acronym for Access to Legal and Procedural Information for Asylum Seekers in Sweden. The project started last year and it will continue until 2018. And I'm responsible for doing research about this access to information for asylum seekers in Sweden. And there are other countries that are part of the project, other European Union countries. So the project is a comparative project between Sweden, Estonia, the UK, Malta, Italy, and Cyprus. And it is a project that is funded by the European Union Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. So this is just very briefly. The presentation today is not fully related. You can say, well, it is related, but it's not exactly about the project. It's only about a small part of the project. Because the presentation today will not focus so much on the actual access to information that asylum seekers have in Sweden once they reach Sweden, and what kind of information do they obtain during the asylum process at different stages of the asylum process. But it's more about the actual law in Sweden and the law within an international context also. So I will continue by showing a graph by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, which is also the main agency that is responsible for, you can say, the care of refugees and displaced people in general, not only refugees, around the world. So this is actually a chart from 2017, but it shows the amount of displaced people around the world in 2016, because the data are from last year, right? So as we can see, we have very different types of people who are displaced, right? And different categories, different legal categories of people who are displaced around the world. We have, at the moment, I mean the world, about 65 million people that are displaced around the world. This means that these are people who basically cannot live in the countries where they were born for reasons of insecurity in the country, or it could be also drought, it could be famine, but very often it's civil wars or external wars. Out of the 65 million people, we have about 21 million people who are actual refugees. What are the refugees? Yes, this is a legal category. It's not everyone from the 65 million people end up being refugees. Refugee is actually a protection status. It's a status, a legal status that someone gets when one applies for asylum in another country and one is granted asylum in that other country on the basis of individual discrimination based on 5 different grounds that are defined in the 1951 Geneva Convention. And since we're at it, as we probably know, most people here probably know, the 1951 Geneva Convention came into being in a certain context, right? Also in a certain international context after the end of the Second World War. The whole idea was to create some kind of international legal ground to protect people from being ending up killed en masse, such as, to avoid things like the Holocaust. So that was the ground on which the Geneva Convention was created in 1951. Many countries around the world have signed, and the Geneva Convention. There are others who haven't signed. Many countries in the Middle East, for example, did not ratify this convention. That is why to have a legal status as a refugee in the Middle East, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, is not possible simply because there is no legal ground for that. But the refugee status is not the only status that one can get in another country, right? You can, if we look retrospectively now in the history, but also if we look at the type of protections people could get when one is forced to leave the country or is forcefully displaced because of war, very often, or because of political persecution, the refugee status nowadays is considered some kind of, relatively speaking, the best possible status that one could get, because it usually comes together with a set of rights, and that's usually a right to permanent settlement in the country of asylum, or it has historically been so, not in all countries, but in most countries. For example, in Sweden, it has been so, or it had been so until last year. And also a set of other types of rights, integration rights, that are quite similar to those of the citizens of that respective country. So acquiring the refugee status is the best form of protection that one could obtain within the legal framework, international legal framework that is currently available in the world. Then we have stateless people. We have about 10 million stateless people around the world that are also displaced. So it's not just stateless people that leave, but of course that's also a question of how one could understand the actual legitimate location for the stateless people, which is a different discussion we will not enter today, at least not during the lecture. And then we have about 108,000 resettled refugees. The resettled refugees are, in Swedish terms, called quota refugees. So these are the quota refugees. And these numbers are numbers from around the world. So it's not Sweden, it's just the amount of quota refugees around the world. These are people who are selected by the UNHCR, which is the UN agency, on basis of being, and they are selected from the camps. They usually reside in the camps around the world, usually in Africa and in the Middle East, but also in Southeast Asia, most of them. And nowadays also in islands around Australia, in Nauru, for example, and also other islands that belong to Australia. And they are very vulnerable, and they very often are in so-called protracted refugee situations, which means that they have been in these camps for between 10 and 30 years. So they are in some kind of limbo situations, stuck in camps without any specific legal status, perhaps without access to the asylum procedure, or somehow, very often without access to the asylum procedure, or perhaps already failed asylum seekers that they cannot be returned nonetheless, because we have a lot of people who were not granted refugee status or any other kind of protection, but nonetheless could not be returned to their countries because of the situation in the country, or because of their own situation, like health situation, for example. So we have all these categories, and I think another important thing to understand about the context is where most of these people are located, right? So if we look at this graph, I don't know how visible it is, but this circle here on the left, we can see that 39% of the displaced people are placed in the Middle East, and it's only 6% that are actually in the European Union. It's actually the smallest percentage around the world, right? Then we have also top hosting countries of displaced people. We have Turkey with 2.5 million. They host the largest number of displaced people in the world. And then we have Pakistan, Lebanon, and Ethiopia, Jordan, and also Iran, actually. a lot of people displaced from Afghanistan. They're mainly displaced in Iran. And well, then we have, so as I said, one thing is displacement, another thing is the actual number of refugees. So from the 63 or 65 million, we have 21 million refugees, and 86% of the world refugees are hosted by developing countries, that, as we've seen. And then I will have to move quite quickly, because I only have 5 minutes left. As we see the number of resettled refugees, the so-called quota refugees around the world, it's only 1% of the actual amount of the displaced people. In this context, now we finally get to Sweden, right? And these are numbers from 2013 to 2016, number of asylum applications, asylum seekers. So these are those who actually made it to Sweden. And we can see the blue line is 2015. That's the highest number. It's up to 160,000 people who have sought refuge in Sweden, asylum seekers. And then we have the lowest line, or the orange line, 2016. And one we can see how this drops severely from 160,000 in 2015 to up to 25,000 in 2016. And of course, the reason for that is actually the new law. We can also see that this line is actually lower than even numbers before 2015, before the big flow, right? 2013 or 2014, before the so-called refugee crisis, right? So why is this huge difference, right? Because what happened is that the new law, and I will move quickly to the legislative changes in 2016 affecting asylum seekers in Sweden. First of all, the decision of introducing temporary border controls and ID checks on transports to Sweden on November 12, 2015, entered into force on January 4th, 2016, and is still in place. Then we have the amendment to the right of welfare assistance under the Reception and Asylum Seekers Act since June 1st, 2016. What is that change? A person who has applied for asylum and received a negative decision is no longer entitled to accommodation and a daily allowance. Which means that after a negative decision, the risk of becoming destitute is high, right? Unless one has one's own resources. Then the third one is the length of the residence permit. That's perhaps one of the most important when one can think of possible consequences of this. Because it used to be the two types of protections that were offered by Sweden, which was the refugee protection under the Geneva Convention 1951, and then the subsidiary protections for those people who did not qualify for the refugee status under the Geneva Convention, but nonetheless they were fleeing countries that could not be returned to. So they could get, and they have been getting, subsidiary protection. Both these forms of protection were permanent until last year. Right now, we have, so after this change in law, we have 3 years refugee protection for those who get refugee status and 13 months for those who get subsidiary protection. After this time, there is possibility to reapply, I guess. We don't know what will happen, but these 13 months will basically start to already, we are approaching that moment in which those people who have gotten subsidiary protection will have their subsidiary protection expiring, and then we will see what will happen, in what way this situation will be handled. And then the fourth thing was the decreased possibility of family reunification that the refugees in Sweden used to have. They still have. Those who get refugee status can still get the right to family reunification, but they need to prove that they have a certain income level to be able to support their family members. So these are the main changes, and I will not have much more time to continue, but I would like to somehow return the discussion back to you, to the audience, and ask, how do you see the consequences? What do you think will happen as an outcome of these consequences within Sweden in terms of the integration possibilities, but also within the international context. I mean, just to ask a very general question. And you are welcome to ask me questions in Swedish. I will answer in English because my Swedish is still, well, I don't feel as confident in Swedish, but I can try to answer if you prefer. Thank you very much for your attention.